What do you need to create the slow motion effect? What camera settings should you choose? How do you edit slow motion footage? And what speed slow motion should you use for different scenarios? Whether you're capturing an epic sports moment, a fun dance, or just want to add a touch of cinematic sugar to your videos, slow motion can really enhance your footage and take your video editing to the next level. First, let's talk about what you're going to need. You're going to need a smartphone or a camera that allows you to set a higher frame rate setting. We'll talk more about frame rates in just a second. The next thing you're going to need is some video editing software like Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, Final Cut, something like that allows you to slow down footage and play it back in slow motion. And the third thing is something that you actually want to film to create the slow motion effect. I'll talk about some examples and what frame rates to use later in this video. Next up comes the filming. I've got 3 tips for you when filming slow motion. The first tip is to try and film wherever possible in really good lighting conditions. More light usually means better quality video when shooting slow motion, depending on the exact camera and settings that you use. Try and film your slow motion outdoors when there's plenty of light, or if you're filming inside, use lights where you can turn up the brightness. The next thing you want to do is set up your camera to film in a higher frame rate than you normally would. Ideally, you want to set at least 50 or 60 frames a second in your camera to get a smooth slow motion effect. And optionally, you might want to consider stabilizing your camera using something like a gimbal, but this is just optional, and if you're using a tripod, you don't need to worry about this. Alright, let's geek out on frame rates for just a second. To get the slow motion effect, you need to film at a higher frame rate, or FPS, then you're going to edit and export your video in. So if your video is being edited and exported at say 30 frames a second, you're going to want to film at a frame rate setting higher than 30. The higher the FPS setting that you use, the more you're going to be able to slow down that footage when you edit. So just choose 50, 60, 100 or 120 FPS in your camera, or go higher if your camera supports it and you really want to create a super slow motion effect. Once you've finished filming at a higher FPS, next comes the fun part, and that's editing. The first thing you need to do is import your footage into your video editing software. I'm using Resolve here, but the same process applies to Premiere Pro and other editing apps. Next, go and create a timeline that you're going to want to edit in. So for example, a 24 frames a second timeline, but your timeline might be 25, 30, or possibly 60 frames a second. You're also going to export in the same frame rate as your timeline editing frame rate. Alright, there's 2 main ways you can create the slow motion effect when editing your videos. If you want the whole clip playing back in slow motion, you can tell your video editing software to kind of pretend the clip is actually a lower frame rate than it was filmed in. So we can open up the footage properties. This clip was filmed in 120 FPS, and we can tell our video editing software to treat it as if it's actually 24 frames a second. Now, when we add it to the timeline, it will already play back in slow motion without us doing anything else. In this example, it will play back at 20% of the original real-world speed. Okay, the second way to edit with slow motion footage is to leave the video clip settings as they are at that higher frame rate setting, and then just go and drag it or add it to your timeline. Then open up the clip playback speed controls and slow it down by however much you want. This method gives you more control over the playback speed. And with this approach, you can use a technique called speed ramping. This is an effect that changes the playback speed over time to create a cool effect. Depending on how much you slow down your clip, you might start to see things looking choppy or jerky. To get the perfect slowdown percentage, you take your editing FPS in your timeline, divide that by the higher FPS footage that you filmed, and multiply it by 100. For example, if you're editing in a 30 FPS timeline and you've got 60 FPS footage, you divide 30 by 60 and multiply by 100, which gives you a 50% slowdown speed. So what frame rate should you set your camera to create the slow motion effect for different scenarios? I've got 6 tips for you for different things, and these all assume that your editing timeline is 24, 25 or 30 FPS. Before we get to those, this video is not sponsored, but this channel is supported by people like you when you buy my 52 Laws of Video ebook. Inside there's 52 ways to make your videos better. Check the first link in the description or scan this QR code today to learn more. Okay, on to those 6 tips. The first tip, or the first scenario, is a general slow motion effect. For this, you're going to want to set a frame frame rate of 50 or 60 in your camera, and you can use this for everyday activities such as walking, slow jogging, casual dancing or sports. These frame rates allow you to slow things down by about 50% of the original speed. Number 2 is that cinematic slow motion effect. For this, you're going to want to use 100 or 120 frames a second in your camera. You can use these frame rates for action-packed sequences like sports or stunts or dramatic moments. These frame rates allow you to slow down your footage significantly, anywhere from about 10% to 25% of the original speed. The third scenario is wildlife or nature. For this, you can use a frame rate of 100 or 120 FPS, and you can use this to capture fast movements of animals flying or running, and the higher FPS helps to show off some of those intricate details of animals moving. Number 4, water and liquid movement. For this, we're going to use 100 or 120 FPS, and you can use this when you're pouring liquids or you've got kind of liquids moving around or droplets of water. And these higher frame rates, when slowed down, emphasize and really draw attention to the fluidity and motion of those liquids. Scenario number 5 is extreme sports or high speed action. For this, you're going to need a higher frame rate, which not all cameras support, such as 240 frames a second or more. This is where the situation is really fast moving and you really want to slow it down, like skateboarding, biking, or really any fast paced activity. Use this when you really want to slow down and capture the movement in those activities. Okay, number 6 are artistic or abstract shots. For these, you can really use anywhere from 50 to 120 frames a second. These frame rates you can use for creative shots like the slow motion of fabric moving or smoke rising up from a candle or a fire. All of those are just guidelines. You should always feel free to be creative. And these videos will help you understand frame rates in a lot more detail. I'm Jason Roberts. Hopefully I'll see you again, and stay creative.